Hurricane Carmen comes in, wreaks havoc to Bayou Battery, Alabama, and that whole area. Their shrimp boat is being blown and tossed by the wind and waves and the fierce storm. Forrest is scared for his life. You see him running out and trying to steer the boat, but to no avail. But Lieutenant Dan has something else on his mind. To him, this storm is a showdown between him and God, and he's going to let God have it. Now, I've been through storms, and I'm sure many of you have as well. I was thinking about some of the hurricanes I've seen, like when we lived in Virginia, and there was a hurricane that came along and it wiped out power in our city we were living in, and most of the places were without power for about a week. And then when we lived in Alabama, another hurricane came up and once again wreaked havoc into that area, knocking out power and causing troubles. We lived in Texas and another hurricane came up. We didn't have as much damage in our area, but later that year we went down to the area that was affected, and about a year later they were still dealing with the damage of that storm. And we've all been through snowstorms, ice storms. There's times when we're driving along and the rain just seems to open up and we can't see anything. We have to pull off to the side of the road or go as slow as possible. I remember once I was out of town on a trip, and the city where we were living in Alabama was having tornadoes at dawn, and the kids were hunkered down in the bathroom, just worried. And I was worried for them because I wasn't anywhere near them. And we know that these storms just cause struggles and make us worried and have lots of doubts and concerns. But of course, we also know that the storm that Lieutenant Dan was facing was more than just wind and rain. Lieutenant Dan was dealing with the loss of his legs, the loss of honor and dignity. He was hoping to die in the war, but he'd come back, and he was now struggling with addiction and depression, searching for meaning and trying to find hope when all seemed lost. And now Lieutenant Dan was just going to let God have it. And these storms of life tend to beat us all down. We've all been blown and tossed by the struggles in our own lives, trying to hold on with white knuckles, trying to survive, afraid that the storms of life are going to overtake us, that the waves of the world are going to crash over us. We can barely hold on. I've experienced plenty of storms. As I was thinking about when I was in 10th grade, my father left town with another man's wife and kids, and we had no idea where he was. And as a young teenager, I was dealt with the anger of him leaving, the abandonment, and just the frustration of what that was going to look like in my life. Early in our marriage, we found ourselves jobless, homeless, staying with some friends. We had a small baby, and we were pregnant with another one. Job rejections were pouring in, and I thought the world was crashing around me. And 5 years ago, when the doctors came to us and told us our son had cancer, it felt like the world had bottomed out. Last month, when they said his cancer had returned, once again, we find ourselves facing a storm. And I know I'm not the only one here that faces storms. Since I've been here, we've had 4 funerals, 4 families who have experienced loss and pain, their loved ones taken from them. You hear stories of people's continual health struggles, their wonderings about diagnoses, their families that are in crisis. They're dealing with broken relationships, splintering marriages, financial worries with the rising costs of everything and suffocating bills. Life is hard. Life is full of storms. And it feels as though sometimes when the one storm slowly dissipates, another one is just coming along and starting to brew. Last week, we began our series on Simon Peter. We saw that Simon Peter started out as a reluctant disciple, who laid down his nest, abandoned his life and his career to follow Jesus. He loved Jesus so much, and yet he found himself continually making mistakes, putting his foot in his mouth, doing things he didn't think he should. As Adam Hamilton says, that Simon Peter, faithful, bold, yet easily confused, deterred, and oh so flawed. He reminds us of ourselves. He reminds us that despite our flaws, we can still follow Jesus. Peter is like you and me, someone who wants to love and follow Jesus wholeheartedly, but continues to get in the way of himself. And when we first meet Simon Peter, he's on a boat. After a long and fruitless night of fishing, tired, exhausted, overwhelmed, ready to call it quits and just go home and sleep. But then Jesus shows up. And once again, today we find Simon Peter on a boat on another terrible night. It says, well into the night. And some suggest this was probably around 3 a.m. that this story takes place. A strong wind was blowing and the waters were rough. The boat was already a considerable distance from land. Somewhere in the middle of that lake, it's being buffeted by the waves, and the disciples were straining at the oars because the wind was against them. The Sea of Galilee is known for its storms. It's known to have these fierce storms rise up. The sea sits about 700 feet below sea level. It's the lowest freshwater body in the world. It's also surrounded by dormant volcanoes that raise up about 1,600 feet from the banks, and storm systems will get caught in that area and just make life hard for those on the water. And Peter and his friends, they were fishermen. They were familiar with life on the water. They knew the risks that it was to be on that sea. But perhaps that night, the storm was greater than he or his fisherman friend had ever experienced before. But in the storm, they do what they have been trained to do, what they've always done. They begin to row. They begin to do what they can to battle the storm, to work hard, to put your head down and get through it. It says the disciples were straining at the oars because the wind was against them. They had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. The disciples had spent their night rowing against the wind, but to no avail. It was supposed to be a simple voyage to get from point A to point B, but it turned into a fight for their life. Trying against all odds, these group of fishermen and others were just trying to stay afloat. They were like Forrest, who was running out and trying to grab the ship's wheel, finding out that was no good. The storm had taken over them. Meanwhile, back on the beach, it says that Jesus had dismissed the crowd and went up to the mountainside to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land. Jesus is on the beach. And as we look at the story, I want to give you 3 truths that you can take with you as you face the storms of your life. That first is that Jesus sees us in our storms. The second is that Jesus joins us in our storms. The third is that Jesus speaks to us in our storms. First, we see that Jesus sees us in our storms. It says that he saw the disciples straining at the oars. As I said earlier, it was about 3 to 4 miles away that these disciples were from Jesus, halfway across the lake. And Jesus looks out in the midst of a storm and he sees them. He sees them straining their oars. He sees them trying to stay afloat. There are times in life when we're in the midst of a storm. It seems like Jesus is far off. He's all the way at the beach. Maybe it feels like he's even turned his back on us. Jesus is ignoring us. We have no idea what he's doing or where he's gone. I know I've felt that way. And I felt like Lieutenant Dan asking the question, where is this God of ours? This God who says he will never leave us or forsake us. And I felt alone and forgotten. The story tells us that while the disciples were a considerable distance from the shore, Jesus saw them. And we too feel alone in the midst of our storms, but know that that is not the case. Jesus sees us in our storm. He sees the storm all around us, but it doesn't stop there. It says that he joins us in our storm. It says shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. As the disciples are battling the elements, Jesus begins to journey towards them. He begins to walk on the storm towards his beloved disciples. And I know that when I am in storms, sometimes I feel like I can't see him. I'm blinded by the winds and the waves, distracted, trying to do all I can to stay afloat, to row the boat, to grab the wheel, to bail some water. I don't see Jesus walking towards me. I don't recognize him. And even when I see Jesus walking towards him like the disciples, I can be afraid. You see, it says when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they cried out in fear. The disciples see Jesus coming towards them, but they have no idea what's going on. And their fear is amplified because they see something otherworldly approaching. They think it's a ghost. Because this isn't a natural occurrence. It's not like they would walk along the river and Jesus would always be walking on the water. Jesus was doing something new, something they didn't understand, something that was outside their frame of reference. So they cry out, thinking it's a ghost. And when we go through storms, know that Jesus walks across the storm to meet us where we're at. He hikes across the wind and the waves to show us that we are not alone. Jesus joins us in the storm. And he shows up in ways that we might not expect. We might expect Jesus to show up with a miracle healing or a restored relationship or a financial blessing. It doesn't always show up that way. Sometimes it shows up in just a meaningful conversation with a doctor or a family member or a friend. Or perhaps it's a phone call of encouragement or a letter you receive in the mail or some sort of sense of comfort and peace, even though you know you shouldn't be feeling that way. When the storms of life buffet us, when we feel like we're all alone, know that Jesus walks towards you in the storm. And then we said, that Jesus speaks to us in our storm. Jesus immediately says to these disciples, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. In the midst of our storms, we hear Jesus calling out to us, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. When we're surrounded by the fears of life, his voice overpowers the wind and the waves. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. The voice that spoke the world into existence, that said, let there be light, The word of God that became flesh and dwelt among us says, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. The one who commanded Lazarus to come out of the grave. The voice that proclaimed victory over death when he shouted, it is finished. He offers the command to our heart. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Because he knows that fear is a natural response to an overwhelming situation. When the storms of life bash against us, we fear for our lives. We just want to quit and let the waters overtake us. He is there with us. Fear is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. We struggle with fear all the time, often without realizing it. It's an amazing capacity to keep us trapped and paralyzed. It keeps us from experiencing the life that God has intended for us. My father left our family. I was afraid, sad, hurt. We found ourselves jobless, homeless, I was afraid. When the doctors came and told us it was cancer, I was terrified. Each day, I wrestled with fear of losing my son, fear of losing my family, fear of the world falling apart. But each day, Jesus says, take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. And it's those three little words in the center that we need to cling to the most. It is I. These three little words are the reasons we can take courage. These are the reasons we should not be afraid. It is I. It is Jesus coming towards us. It is Jesus calling out to us. It is Jesus who is walking on the storm. The one who left his home in heaven, the one who came to earth, he is the one who is walking towards us in our storm. So this story is told in three different Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John. And in Mark and in John, Jesus walks on the water. He comes to the boat and gets in, and suddenly the seas are calm and everything's better. And for most of us, that's how we want the story to end. We want Jesus to come to the middle of our storms, get in our boat, and everything's great. Yet Matthew tells us a different story. He tells us about Simon Peter. Simon Peter was characteristically impulsive. He leaps before he looks, which is still better wisdom than someone who looks for so long that he never leaps. Simon Peter does the unthinkable, the ridiculous. He asks Jesus to join him. He asks to join Jesus on the water. Because he says, Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to the water. And who in their right mind would do such a thing? Peter believes that the best place to be is on the water with Jesus than in the boat with the other disciples. The disciples think the best place to be in the storm is in the boat, to stay in the boat, to wait for Jesus to come to them. The boat is their comfort zone, the boat they have control over. They've been on boats before, they've been through storms before, maybe they can just ride it out. Logic tells them to stay on the boat. Fear keeps them from taking a risk, from experiencing something new. Uncertainty keeps us from stepping out of the boat. When we stay in the boat, it keeps us, though, from growing in our faith. We don't take risks in our faith. We become stagnant, predictable, and even boring. If you're not stretching yourself to experience Christ in new and life-changing ways, you have just try to be content and you wait for Jesus to come to you. And that's what these 11 disciples were up to. They didn't want to risk anything. They waited for Jesus to come in and keep them safe. To let the storm walker come to them, to stay in the boat, to stay in their comfort zone. And I wonder if Matthew, being an eyewitness to this account, had a twinge of remorse, thinking maybe he should have been one that stepped out to the water. Imagine relaying the story to others, telling them about what Peter did, and then asking, so what was it like to walk on the water? Only to say, well, I don't know. I stayed in the boat. But Peter, impulsive, impetuous Peter, he knows that the best place to be in the storm is not in the safety of the boat, but walking alongside Jesus, the storm walker. Look, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to the water. This is what Jesus says. He says, come. And Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water, came toward Jesus. Stepping out of the boat defies logic. Stepping out of the boat requires risk. Stepping out of the boat says that we trust Jesus. Stepping out of the boat shows that the fear of the Lord is greater than the fear of the world, the fear of the storm. And stepping out of the boat says that we are motivated not by fear, by faith. As Hamilton says, we are motivated primarily by faith rather than fear. We recognize, as Peter did, that the adventure is outside the boat. Peter had come to trust Jesus just enough, even though he was scared, to say yes to Jesus' call for him to walk on a stormy sea. We let the storms of life keep us from taking risks in our walk with Jesus. We wait for Jesus to come to us. We cling to our security blankets. We try to stay in our comfort zones because we know that walking out in faith takes risk. Trusting God to work in and through us, to not simply help us, is scary. Asking God to join us, to join him in his work, and not simply asking God to join us in ours. That can be life-changing and also overwhelming. Of course, we know what happens next, which might lead us to think, well, the other 11 actually had it right. Maybe staying on the boat was better. Maybe staying on the boat was the right call. Because staying in the boat keeps us afloat. Staying in the boat keeps us relatively dry. Staying in the boat keeps us somewhat safe. And so we look down on Peter for letting the wind and the waves overwhelm him. We want to chastise Peter for his moments of distraction while we sit safely on the boat. It says, when Peter saw the wind, he was afraid. He began to sink, and he cried out, Lord, save me. Peter began to drown. He saw the wind, and he took his eyes off the storm walker, and he fixed his eyes on the troubles of the world, instead of fixing his eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. He took a risk, and he began to sink. But was never in any real danger. It says that immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. The hand of Christ begins to rescue Simon Peter from certain death. So, unlike the other disciples, Simon Peter has a story of salvation to tell. A story of a storm, a powerful, overwhelming storm that threatened their little boat. A story how Jesus came walking on the water in the midst of the storm. A story how Peter realized that being with Jesus walking on the storm is better than being in the boat. And a story of how, even though he was distracted, Jesus rescued him. And he extended his hand of mercy to pull him out of the depths. As Jesus extends his hand to all of us, we are all sinking in the depths of our sin, overwhelmed by the storms of life. And yet Jesus extends his nail-scarred hand down to each and every one of us. We all have wavering faith, especially when the storms of life seem overwhelming. When we take our eyes off of Jesus, but remember, Jesus sees us in our storm. Jesus joins us in our storm. Jesus speaks to us in our storm. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Come. Walk with me in the storm. It's better to be with me than in the boat. Storms are going to come and go. They feel frightening and overwhelming. Maybe they may be more than you can handle. You might want to keep yourself holed up in the boat, locked in fear, waiting for Jesus. You might not want to take that risk. You might not want to step out in the storm. But Jesus calls you to come and walk with him. So just think about what storm you're facing. What is going on in your life that seems overwhelming? And how might Jesus be coming, walking to you in the midst of your storm? Not only that, how is he inviting you to join him, to walk with him? What risk is he asking you to take? How is he asking you to trust him? I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer for me. I don't know the answer for you, but I know Jesus is there. And he's calling us to come and walk with him. And sometimes it seems overwhelming and scary. So you need to ask, are you willing to join him? And he says, come, walk with me in the storm. Because walking out in storms, though, can be dangerous. But he is still with us. The wind might not stop blowing. The waves might not stop crashing. And Jesus might not make that storm go away. He might not silence the storm. But know this, walking with Jesus somehow can make the storm less terrifying. Feeling Jesus' presence with us can help us be calm in the midst of the storm. Even when the storm is raging all around us, he is walking beside us. Because the best place to be in the storm is not the safety of a boat, but walking alongside Jesus.